Welcome to Recruiting.work, a place to connect, communicate, and collaborate on all things recruitment. This session is brought to you by Outmatch. Just as Recruiting.work brings people in the talent community together, Outmatch brings recruitment technologies together, combining assessments, video interviewing, and reference checking software. They're creating a more holistic, more human hiring experience. Learn more at outmatch.com. Good morning, and thank you everybody for attending another session of Recruiting.work, where peer practitioners across the industry get together to talk about various items. This is another session of our ongoing series around DE&I, and I'm going to be turning over to Christina to moderate here in a quick second because she has about 1 million times more depth of knowledge than I do on this. With that said, Christina, I'll sort of turn it over to you and let you take it from here.
Good morning or afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are in the country. Thank you so much, Sean. Welcome to this month's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion conversation, where we're talking about started from the bottom, now we're here. We'll get into what that means in just a moment. But before we do that, I just wanted to wish everyone a very happy Women's History Month. Yesterday was International Women's Day. And also, if you happen to be working in the construction industry, I wanted to wish you a special shout out and a very happy Women's Week in the construction industry, and a shout out for showing up today and every day in the industry that is dominated by men, and showing up and shattering ceilings there. So today, started from the bottom, now we're here. What does that mean? If you were here last month, and by the way, if you were here last month, you showed up on the second Tuesday of the month, because that's when we're here at 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. But if you showed up last month, this conversation sort of came out of a conversation that we had last month. Amanda was here then too. Good to see you again. And when we were chatting last month, we mentioned that the new recruiting is sort of about internal mobility, right? And so this month's conversation is sort of a shoe off of last month's conversation, which is, how do we stop recruiting or make almost an alternate path for recruiting, right? Besides just one-to-one recruiting, right? So instead of just going out and finding people, what are other ways that we can really increase diversity and inclusion? So internal mobility, we're going to talk about recruiting for transferable skills, and we're going to really talk about how to increase diversity and inclusion by finding folks that are outside of industries and bringing them into the industry that you're recruiting for today. Okay, so I started from the bottom, now we're here. Our goal is always to bring you ways that you can operationalize these things. So we're going to try to give you step by step on how you can do some of these things. There are no questions that we're afraid to answer. So if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them in the chat. As always, we'll try to get to them. This is only supposed to be a half-an-hour conversation. We normally go over. We understand if you have to drop early. We'll try to get through as much as the real meaty stuff as we can in the next 25 minutes. That being said, we'll go ahead and get the conversation started. To the panelists, if you don't mind introducing yourself and what company you're from prior to starting your section, it would be really greatly appreciated so that everybody knows where you're coming from. But let's start by talking a little bit about what we talked about in our last convo. Samantha, you're new here, but Melissa, you were in our last conversation. Amanda, you were in our last conversation. And if we could just sort of do a 1B almost of the last conversation and almost pick up from where we left off in terms of internal mobility. One of the things that we said was like, look, we understand that one of, obviously the main meat of recruiting is always going to be there, right? But one of the really important aspects of recruiting moving forward is going to be identifying talent that already exists within our organizations and finding ways to repackage that talent, if you will, and develop that talent and move it to other parts of the organization in order to retain that talent. Can you talk a little bit about how your organization might be doing this or might not be doing this, and talk about any of the programs that you might be involved in order to make this happen currently?
I can start.
So I'm happy to. Go for it, Melissa.
Sorry, Amanda. We actually just got off an HR TA combined call with our group and just talking about this topic. And so essentially, my name is Melissa Medrano. I work at NGM Biopharma. So we're a biopharmaceutical company, and a lot of what we hire are scientists. And one of the things that's we were literally just talking about is setting up some sort of a, how do you set up a rotational type of program? Like at a larger company, I know Genentech, Roche, and Gilead have a lot of, opportunities for internal transfers, but you also have, opportunities. For example, we love scientists who go into project management or scientists who go into regulatory affairs. And those are opportunities for people who might want to get away from the bench, but how do you make those also internally advertise them? And I see someone asked about the internal job board, and we do, but it's also kind of so many times when I was at my last role at Gilead Sciences, there'd be people who like, oh, I didn't see that this was posted until today and it's already filled, but how do I make myself available and aware of internal opportunities? Especially when people may not be going to the internal job boards or from month to month may forget. So we are talking about implementing these types of programs, but also, have gone through those types of things at other companies, and I think that they've worked successfully. But the other thing is just kind of having those types of internal career panel discussions with leaders from different areas and stuff, so that people can also be learning about what other types of pivoting roles might be available that they might not be thinking about because they're thinking about movement upward.
That makes sense to me. When I think about retaining, especially folks in our underrepresented communities, first of all, when I think about just recruiting folks right now, right, and the amount of attention that people in underrepresented communities are getting right now, and the amount of inboxes and et cetera, right? It becomes really important to try to make sure that folks are feeling seen and that folks are aware of internal opportunities and internal movement, et cetera. Is anyone here, you mentioned, Melissa, the internal job boards, is anyone here making sure that that internal positions are posted, maybe even prior to being available to external candidates?
Yeah, so Amanda Radice here. I'm currently a senior diversity talent strategist at SurveyMonkey. I've got a little over a decade of recruiting experience. Been an agency, Macy's corporate, Google, Facebook, and done like diversity and equitable like hiring focus at all of them. So I've seen it in different organizations. At SurveyMonkey, we're definitely, we have our internal job board. There's some positions that we'll post internal only at first. And our recruiting team too is like very well conditioned. And we have an intake form to make sure the question is asked, like, who internally could do this role? Is there anyone that we would consider? Or have we thought about people from this team or that team? We have a whole like internal mobility process outlined, like what it takes to be eligible and what those like requirements are for internal transfer, what the process is and how leaders are supposed to work together. But what I think is really important at SurveyMonkey, beyond all of that, is we have quarterly conversations with our managers that are built in called GIGS. It stands for Growth, Impact, and Goals. Every individual contributor or manager, everyone will have this with their direct supervisor every quarter, where you kind of talk about how did I grow, what impact did I have, what goals did I accomplish over the past quarter, and then also like setting what you want to do for the next quarter. And that creates a regular space every quarter for employees to speak to their manager about what they want to do next. And I think that's so important. It creates that space and opportunity for for individuals to advocate for what they want. I think then the gap is like, when you have people who don't have as strong a voice, what are we doing to empower them to speak up? So I'd be interested to hear if what other companies are doing and how you can kind of enable individuals to feel confident to share their goals, so that we can then start creating opportunities for them to strengthen a new muscle or develop a different skill set in a different area.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. Proactively understanding what people want to do instead of sort of reacting to what we have available and then trying to backfill it. Samantha, hi.
Hey, Samantha here, and I work with Computer Futures, and we're actually a recruitment agency. So I like being on these because I see it from so many different types of clients rather than kind of the internal side of things too. I recruit in the Salesforce space, so everything I work with is kind of in the tech world one way or another. But I think something we've been hearing more recently, this is like a little tangential of kind of what we've been talking about, but one of the main issues I think that a lot of companies are facing right now is, how do I keep my internal talent engaged when we're all remote? I feel like everybody had a very different connection to their teams, before, when we were in offices and working along these types of just kind of how do we build those connections. And one of the things, this is, one story that I heard, but basically someone mentioned that they wanted to work within a different team within the company, wanted that growth, and mentioned it to their manager and got a lot of pushback, that the manager felt pretty attacked, that they didn't want to work for them anymore. And, I think in this environment, it's just, there are a number of different factors kind of affecting how open candidates are to put their hand up and say, I want to move within the company. And I think, Amanda, you made a really good point that, you guys do training with all of these direct managers around once a quarter, asking, what do you want to be doing? Is it right here on this team? What are these growth opportunities for you? So I think a lot of times the biggest opportunity in this space is almost the L&D, the learning and development of the higher ups around really being super supportive of internal mobility, keeping great talent, even if it's not on your specific team, contributing to your headcount. There is still huge value to, growing people within the company like that.
Oh, 100%, right? And I think, one of the great things about SurveyMonkey that draws me to the company is that the employee value proposition, right? This is our aspirational goal is to be where the curious come to grow. And, Becky Canteri, our chief people officer, has said, when people come to SurveyMonkey, I want them to continue to grow, to learn, to develop skill sets. Obviously, we want them to stay and create opportunity for people to grow internally. But if they do end up leaving, I want people to feel like they've learned something here, they've grown, they've developed. And that thread shows throughout, we have, different speakers that come in across, whether it's big, small, very team specific, or large company, specific speakers. We have different mentorship programs and matching. Our employee resource groups put on a lot of things. The other thing we have that are cool are curiosity chats, small group conversations that you kind of apply for with a leader. That talk about, different things. I'm in one right now talking about self-advocacy. So there's a small group of us that meet with, our chief legal officer and kind of talk through different things we're facing, and she gives advice. And I was able to participate in one with the president of the company about business acumen and how do you understand how a company's performing? Because I'm not an accountant. I don't do business things, right? So now I can look at a balance sheet or understand what stocks to invest in. So it's really cool that we have opportunities like that. And it also gives you exposure to people from other teams and get a sense of what they do. So I think programs like that are so important just to have the visibility and that learning opportunity. So if you're not doing something like that at your company, I would highly recommend it. I am a beneficiary of these programs and it's been great learning for me. So
yeah. No,
Yeah.
I took all, there was a at my last company, they had getting along in a matrixed environment, and we played the game of, building a business, and it was a biopharma company. But what was so interesting was just kind of how, um, people kind of need a safe space to be able to step out and inquire. And so that was what was nice about that, is that the recruiters were kind of the we were the safe space for them to sort of say, hey, I have questions about career development. I'm interested in, something that maybe isn't the traditional path. Can you kind of help me, navigate through the drug development process, and kind of figure out where else I could go and where I could leverage my skill sets. And that was such a powerful kind of position to be in, just because then, we'd keep it confidential until we kind of help them socialize it through the right channels. And so I think that's a lot of it too, is like you said, people get upset if they're like, well, wait, you don't want to work with me anymore. But I think it's also a question of, a good manager knows, or can be trained to understand that, the best thing that you can do for a good employee is to help them grow and nurture their career. And what we would always say to hiring managers is, well, wouldn't you rather keep a great person at the company than lose them to another company, because they're going to, look for these opportunities either way. But I like the curiosity groups, and I made a note of that. I think that's really cool. We have coffee chats with our CEO in small group sessions, but I really like the idea of a curiosity group, and kind of like, just bringing different breakout sessions of people within the company together who might be interested in that, and interested in exploring kind of other avenues for their careers. But I did want to just quickly also highlight, one of the things that kept coming up last time that we were talking about was just kind of always be thinking in that recruiter mindset. And I think that's what's helpful when you're having these conversations with internal employees too, is, kind of keeping that, always be recruiting, always be, thinking about how you can leverage talent and continue to grow them. And, we've been having a lot of sort of succession planning conversations at our company as well too. And, realizing we're kind of behind the eight ball a little bit in that. And so really, I think it's all part of the same conversation, right? We want to grow our talent and get diverse people kind of, or people from underrepresented groups up, in the leadership roles, but we also need to be, kind of replenishing the talent and stuff too.
Yeah. So let's one of the things I feel like we've identified in all of our chats, right, even through last year, is the need to not be in silos. And I think that we all know that in our minds, right? Like as recruiters, we're never working in silos. We're always working with our hiring managers. We're always working with HR. We're always working with candidates. And we know that, right? From a certain business perspective, we have all of these partners. However, as we move forward, it becomes even more and more important to understand that there's like a meshing even that needs to happen, even more than just a partnership, right? Touch points of where we need to partner. There's a meshing that happens in the DE&I space. And I think Amanda almost probably can attest to this more than anything, because she's responsible for DE&I recruiting. So there's an absolute marriage almost that happens there, right? But there's a meshing almost that needs to happen between us and our stakeholders and business partners in order to make some of these things come to life, right? Because even, especially for internal mobility, right, there's a learning and development aspect that has to go really hand in hand super closely with recruiting in order to make this super successful. It has to be more than just a touch point business partnership relationship. It has to be like, what can we do in order to make this feel seamless for the folks that it's going to touch in order to have real impact? And that's what we're looking for at the end of the day, real impact, right? So the first way that we can be really successful as recruiters outside of just filling roles, right, is to grow our internal talent. But the second way is started from the bottom. Now we're here, is finding folks from other industries, right? Which is also not one-to-one, right? It's not looking at a resume, checking all the boxes, and then finding folks from the same industry, comparable company, and just sort of filling in that slot. So let's talk about maybe even the difficulty of maybe finding a candidate that could be really great for a position in a different industry and some of those transferable skills. And maybe let's talk about how those conversations with hiring managers might look, because there's going to be some convincing sometimes that happens with that. But it does really open up our options, right? To find groups, folks from different groups there. So can we talk a little bit about maybe times that you've had to do that, what that looks like, and et cetera?
I think leading with data is always important. When I have these conversations with hiring managers where, I'm kind of starting out, right? The last thing you want to do is start out with like a no. You can't have this. You can't have everything you want. But I think what we've tried to do is get away from kind of talking about the ideal candidate. So I think that's the first and most important thing. Is there's no ideal candidate. You're not going to be able to carve something out of clay and put them in your lab or whatever. And so then the second thing I think is also talking about we're in the Bay Area, right? Or I am. If all these people are on the East Coast and they don't want to move here, then we can't have them. And then if people here have, sort of an ancillary skill set and are not necessarily 100% a fit, are we going to be able to make do with what we have in play? Or is there somebody internally here or another avenue that you can think of where we can, build or grow the talent? And so those conversations in science are really hard to have, because it's like, well, I'm sorry, I need somebody with the science background or at least a PhD or whatever. But I think the important thing is what we've been trying to do is kind of also influence people to think outside of, okay, well, even though Stanford and UCSF are in our backyard, we don't need to look there. And that doesn't mean, we need to be blasting up the HBCUs, because I know that they're getting blasted up. But, over 80% of Black people are not Black students are not enrolled in the HBCU. So it's like, okay, let's think about, I went to undergrad at New Mexico State University. I got an undergrad in science there and went to Tufts for grad school. Let's think about the people who are working in the labs or doing other things that might not be, in the Stanfords or the UCSFs, but how do we get them? And they may not be publishing in Nature or Cell or Science, but they publish in great journals that are still peer reviewed and might be good fits. So, I think that's kind of the sort of broadening of horizons that we've been getting our scientists to do. But I know in G&A, it can be a little bit different as well, right? When you need those specific skill sets, you can't, slap a finance person into an accountant position and vice versa. So.
Yeah. And Melissa, I got to tell you, I love the broadening of horizons. The one thing I do sort of disagree with you on, though, is there is an ideal candidate, but at what cost? This is the cost. You end up recycling the same candidates from different companies, the same opportunity, the same access, the same perspective, the same background, the same education, the same skin color, the same, the same, all the things. Yep. And what you're missing is the perspective, but what you're missing is, all the other really important intangible things that maybe somebody that doesn't check all those little tiny boxes that maybe are not completely necessary to do the job is missing, right? So but I do love the broadening of horizons. And you're right, in certain positions like science, you can't say, look, we need a PhD, but we're going to slap somebody with something else in there. So it does get a little bit hairy. But I do really like what you all are doing in order to compensate for some of that in other areas too. Amanda, I didn't mean to cut you off. I know you were trying to get in there.
No, you're fine. You're fine. Yeah, I was just going to say, like, for me, I think everything, so, there's the counter argument to this is like, we don't have time, but you got to make time. Everything should be proactive, right? And I like to look at things like, especially with diversity, that can't be a retrofit when you're hiring or when you're promoting or it's got to be baked into the plan. It's got to be something you're doing operationally instead of like, oh, we have all these candidates, but we want to diversify. So can you bring in some people? No, right? We got to be thinking up front. And the first thing that I will ask, well, not the first thing, but one of the first things in that initial meeting is like, what's trainable? What on your team do you have bandwidth to train? Because not every team will have the bandwidth to support someone. So if there are certain skills that are required because no one can teach them that, you don't want to bring in someone and set them up to fail. But if there are other skills and they say, yeah, we got some people on the team who are great at this, who are looking for opportunities to mentor, and they could coach someone on these things, like you want to start getting your hiring managers thinking about those things in advance. So now we're looking at, okay, here's the ideal profile. If we can find it, great. Here are the things that are super coachable. And we have the ability to develop someone. So if they don't have these things, we can teach them. And that starts to open the doors a little bit, right? And then if you start getting into, here are some transferable skills, you start asking the questions, what about this company versus that? What about, okay, we're doing sales. Does it have to be SaaS sales? Could someone with retail be developed because of the selling, and you have to start having those conversations up front. To create those opportunities for development. And I think the other thing too is if you have time for a position, like we're not going to be dead in the water if we don't fill this in the next month, maybe there's someone internally who's interested in that space who could split like 20% of the time supporting that team and fill the gap for a little bit, develop some skills, see if that's a transition they want to make. Am I going to say that SurveyMonkey does this all the time and is great at it? No. Have we had some opportunities and where have I seen where someone says, I know this person wants to get into product management. Let's partner with their VP and, kind of work something out. I think those types of things are really important, but you have to have those conversations up front because if you don't, then you're, leaving so much opportunity, right?
And really quickly, Samantha, I know that you want to talk. I just want to address the folks that have to leave in the next 2 minutes and say thank you so much for joining the conversation. We're going to keep going. I want to address a question in the chat real quick before we go from Natalia that says, so are you saying that HBCUs aren't a great place to advertise? I don't think that's the message that you should take away from this. HBCUs are a great place to post your positions. I think, though, where the disconnect is that we shouldn't be thinking about positions only as a place to advertise, right? If I could leave you with 3 words to take away today, if you're leaving in the next 1 minute, it's diversify your portfolio. HBCUs should not be the only place that you're looking for Black students to come on board. There are so many other places. Melissa mentioned that 80% of Black students are not at HBCUs. Right? You've got to become more familiar with where your target demographics are. And if the only place that that Black and brown students are at HBCUs, then you've got to get more familiar with where your audience is, right? And go after the place where your audience is. And not only that, but we've got to think about this more holistically than just advertising, right? Posting your position is one very small part of the job. Creating relationships is much more important than posting the position. But more importantly than that, right? Like making sure that we're going after candidates in places where not only where it makes sense, but also where we can grow them in positions and where we can retain them is also really more important than just this pinpoint sort of advertising that's a one-time deal. And what's really important is that we're creating an ecosystem where people can end up thriving, right? So all of those, posting it, advertising it, important, not as important as knowing where the majority of your target demographic is, and really making sure that you're targeting audiences there, right? The other thing I'll say really quickly is in vibe with somebody outside of your tribe, right? Look, I'm not saying LinkedIn is the best way to go, but also really, really easy. Like if you're connected with lots of folks that are not necessarily folks that you would, have in your network all the time, even if you're not reaching out and having coffees, what happens is that your feed gets diversified as well. And you'll come across organizations that will not usually be in your purview. And you can reach out to folks within those organizations, right? Or you can just become more familiar with those organizations and educate yourself so that you have a more realistic and a holistic perspective of where you should be advertising or thinking or knowing your business, educated about your business versus just thinking, again, pinpoint advertising. So those are the things that I would leave you with if you have to leave right now. And so sorry, Samantha, you're on.
No worries. Two of the things that kind of from the two conversations that, or, answers that came before, I feel like often our responsibility as a recruiter is to also, I know, Amanda, like you were saying, asking around what can be trained. And I often feel like it does also come from us to promote like what we see as transferable in across a lot of different types of roles. I mean, I work in the tech space. They're supposed to know Salesforce, but outside of that, what all of the managers, and when I take a phone reference and I talk to everything from a CTO to a manager, all these things, like the answer I get back is like, they wanted to learn. They were hungry. They would put their hand up when a project came in. They were great on deadlines. They could communicate, and like, doesn't matter what type of role they were running. Those are the things that always come back as what's really important to the people that worked with them. They never say, I was so glad they came in with my industry knowledge. That's never the answer we get back from a reference. So it does, in our roles, it's really important I use references all the time. I think it helps show a lot of the strengths that are there, but I do also spend a lot of time trying to make sure that our managers do really understand across all the types of industries what's really important for them to be testing in interviews where, maybe they don't think they have flexibility in certain things, but they actually might, when they truly think about it, there are always going to be things that they don't want to teach because they don't have the time or they need the expert to maybe be teaching people down the line. But I do think a lot of times this kind of comes back. I always think L&D is like where a lot of these things come from. And I do think that in this instance, it is important to highlight the ability to be flexible on certain things, personally. And then I had a second point, but it's escaping me. So we'll stick with one for now.
Well,
if it comes up, I'll mention
it. If you remember, jump in and interrupt me. But I was going to say, like, bouncing off of what Samantha was saying on the flip side of that, like, as recruiters, which a lot of us are on this call or people who'll be watching this, something you can do and incorporate, if you're not already doing this, when you speak to candidates, ask them to walk you through a time where they like had to learn something on the job or they had to teach themselves, right? Like, when were you given a project that you didn't know, didn't have the skills to complete, but you figured it out, right? And the same conversations can happen with internal individuals. So if you're connecting with someone who wants to make a move internally, ask for an example of that, because when the hiring manager says like, oh, but they don't have this skill, and say, no, but they've demonstrated the ability to learn on the job and be successful. And so you can have that in your back pocket. So if you're always asking that ability to grow, to learn on the job, like to know what questions to ask, like those are all so valuable that it will make it that much easier to like train someone or help them flex. So I think that's something that if you're not already asking your candidates or your internal, your employees who want to make internal moves, ask them for examples of that, because you can use that to like demonstrate, hey, look, they can do this. We just need to support them,
I don't know if y'all have had this experience. I know for me personally, that scrappy factor, I mean, to that's been one of the biggest assets of my personal career success, right? Just being able to figure things out. And, I don't know if that's also been part of your success in your career, but for me, that's just such an important aspect. And Amanda, you're so right. Like just being able to have that quality, even if you're not able to check all of the boxes as a candidate, becomes such an important thing to have in moving into any space, really. So
one of my favorite, I'm so sorry.
No, Melissa.
One of my favorite questions that actually our CFO brought in was, or, kind of a favorite competency that she brought in is grit. Do you have the power to dig in and stick with it? And, but I also think, one of the other things that comes up is I've right now we're in kind of build out mode, and I've been involved with a few build outs. And I think one of the important things that I wanted to call out too is just as the group continues to grow and each new person brings different things that maybe are unexpected, I think it's so important also to revisit with the hiring managers at each point, not just have, the typical kind of intake session or whatever, but be like, okay, how is your group evolving? How is because that might help us figure out how to pivot the skill sets too, or broaden the capabilities that we can consider. So I think part of it is diversity of thought as well, right? We want to be bringing people who are thinking about the problems differently, and maybe that can also help us open up what we can consider.
I'm really happy that you mentioned that, Melissa, because I was just about to sort of pivot into that area. So we've talked about, speaking of starting from the bottom, now we're here, right? We started as thinking about it from a candidate perspective or an employee, right? Started from the bottom, and now, we talked about internal mobility, right? Moving up. We talked about starting from a different industry, and now, we've talked about some ways that we can recruit folks from different industries. We've talked about transferable skills, and now we're sort of chatting about how to talk to hiring managers and what that looks like in evolving teams. And one of the things that I sort of wanted to end the conversation with is, can we talk a little bit about business acumen and knowing the business? Amanda started the conversation with those intake meetings, right? And like, what's important to you, what is transferable, what's not. And then Melissa, you just mentioned, okay, once we have those conversations, what's evolving and what's not. And how important is it that we as the business partner understand our business, right? And so once we have those original intake meetings, really understand what positions are on the teams of our business partners so that we can take it not only for what it is at that moment, but then we can take that information to source additional candidates for future roles, right? So again, we're building pipelines, constantly always be recruiting so that it doesn't take that long to fill those positions with folks from underrepresented communities or whatever that target space is. But then also, Melissa, to your point, like how do then we also get ahead, maybe not even at the intake meeting, but how do we make sure that our business acumen stays on point so that we know in real time when things are evolving? Can we talk about that? How do we stay aligned with the business so that we're not having reactive conversations, so that we're not the last people to know when things are evolving, so that we can always be recruiting?
I think it's so important, when we have, like our weekly meetings or bi-weekly meetings with the hiring managers, to really talk to them and not just be like, okay, we're discussing candidates, we're discussing blah, 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 but what are the deeper business needs, and what are, I talk to, in pharma, it's you're talking about the different molecules and the different programs and different therapeutic areas, but it's also one of those things where competitive intelligence is so important. I know I look at like Google Trends quite a bit, as well as, just kind of following along in all the biotech and pharma news. But it's one of those things where it's so important to stay up on the business side of things. But then, at least with drug development, but even with other businesses as well, that's really where you get to know kind of the 30,000-foot skyline view, where people are going to come to you and ask you questions about career development and have those conversations because they know the business kind of in and out, back and forth. And really, I think that's been my favorite conversations where people have learned the most maybe about kind of the whole business side of things and really, taking that and sort of saying, I really can do cross-functional work rather than just kind of stay in my lane.
I think for me, as a recruiter, it's so important to know the business. I know you can be very successful not knowing it at all, right? You can be a successful recruiter by just knowing what the skills are, doing and running through. But I think, especially when it comes to diversity recruitment, and in this space, like, for one, hiring for diversity or doing work in like DEI around the talent space, it's most effective when it's preceded by an assessment of like, why do we have gaps? Why does this underrepresentation exist within this specific team? I think you want to look at that first, because there may be some areas where like, we just haven't done this. We haven't looked here. We haven't, and you can tap into that, right? That's step one. Or if it's like a training problem, if it's a team culture and environment problem, you deal with that. But so know where those gaps are, and that could inform you a little bit on your strategy. But the other piece is like, know the business. You have people who work that you're partnering with who follow blogs, podcasts, Twitter feeds, read certain things, get email digests. You can get those too, right? Find out what the most important places are for that information. I set up a Feedly and I kind of categorize it. That works for me. There may be RSS feeds. Some people do like Google search alerts where you'll get like a digest of certain search terms in your inbox every morning, every week. There are some podcasts you can just play in the background that have updates on whatever industry you're in. So ask your partners, where do you get your information? How do you stay in touch? What are the best podcasts? What are the Twitter feeds that I should be like, whose Twitter should I be following? Is there a list that already exists that would be helpful? And just commit the time every morning. You're having your coffee or your tea or post meditation, whatever works for you to get your day going. And just kind of read through it and just be like, okay, here's what's happening. Oh, this might be important, set yourself up so that you don't have to actively think about it. Like, be proactive and then automate. So if you have a feed that you can click through, if you get in this automatic email, whatever makes sense for you, but use your partners. They're the ones staying up to date in that industry, and they'll tell you how they do it. And you can utilize those same resources and tools.
I always joke about sending out the bat signal because, there was a group of us at my last company that all are now scattered to the winds, and we have an email list. And I just asked them like, hey, we're a smaller company. Like, what are you guys doing for X, Y, or Z? Because, or do you guys, I just got an email from them. Do you guys, is anybody else having, forming ERGs? Did you form them before shelter in place? So it's super nice just to even get the anecdotal evidence about, hey, are you guys, how are you finding this? And even with, software like Intello that we have, that I've been using that hand in hand with LinkedIn, and it's specifically a diversity recruitment software, and it comes up with completely different people. But I would also like to sort of throw back to something that somebody else brought up is, when you're just doing sort of the keyword searches and stuff like that, you're missing all those context clues that will give you deeper information about, sort of the business side of things as well. And so, I always think it's so important to, Wikipedia every new position, like every new position that I work on, I Wikipedia it and learn as much about it as I can, because then you're able to leverage beyond sort of the keyword searches that sort of more superficial recruiters are going to be doing.
And you can do like a semantic search, right? Which will help get those transferable skills from different industries. So instead of looking at this specific software, this specific program, this specific tool, you can look at managed a team of, developed blah, 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 built a new program, and search those phrases. And that may bring up people that you never would have thought of because they're from different industries. They're from different companies. They may be in a different geo. And that starts to pull up. And then you start to see like, oh, I could explore this company. There's a lot of transferable skills in this type of role. So using that semantic search and just removing keywords and just seeing what that gets you, that's another good place to start when you're trying to expand. Because if you keep doing the same thing you've been doing, you are going to get the same results. Like, so you've got to start thinking differently and figure out, how do I break out of my patterns? Because otherwise you're just going to keep hiring the same people and keep finding them and then think, oh, there's no pipeline. There is always pipeline. It's not a pipeline problem. It's a finding people problem for most companies.
Amanda, I also wanted just to piggyback on something that you mentioned earlier about using your business partners to find out information to increase your own business acumen, podcasts, etc. I will tell you, what I have found is that most of my business partners go to majority sources, podcasts by majority folks. There's always a counterpart that is put out by minority sources as well, that are usually just as informative. So it's important to find out where your business leaders are going. And then I also do some research to find out what are some minority sources that I can provide for my business leaders so that they can get a different perspective. So I then give them the podcasts that are led by other folks. And I also then I try to look up people on LinkedIn, like maybe the podcast hosts or whatever, and ask them to reach out to the people. So then I'm helping them vibe with people outside of their tribe. A lot of times what happens is some of those folks don't have full-time jobs, or maybe they do and they're still looking. Those are great places to look for candidates as well. And you know that they're experts in their field, or perhaps they know other people that are looking that are also experts in their field. It's a great way outside of just sort of the normal sourcing that we can find people that are experts. So Samantha, you've been off mute for a while, and I wanted to just also ask you a pointed question about business acumen. We know that we work in organizations where we could really get to know sort of our client groups really intimately, but you work in organizations where you're constantly sort of changing the searches, et cetera. How does it work for you getting to really know positions intimately when they can change on a weekly basis?
Yeah, so I kind of do that in two ways. And I think a little bit about what I said earlier, saying it's our job as recruiters to bring that knowledge. And a lot of my business acumen actually just comes from the understanding of the candidate mindset, what it means when someone's interviewing for a job, coaching every hiring manager that I work with. Don't end an interview saying, okay, good luck, and then hanging up, because that candidate now thinks you mean good luck with the rest of their life and they're never going to hear from you again. And like, it's the little moments that we know so much more information about what candidates want, about what their experience looks like. So when it comes to business acumen, for me, my definition of that is often the recruiting business, and that a customer or a candidate interviewing with you is actually their first touch point with you as a company. And a lot of people, especially if you're looking for experts in their fields, are going to remember exactly what that interview process was like, how long it took them to get feedback, what that feedback was like, in these types of things. And I know it's a little bit different than the internal mobility side of things, but that's kind of my side of things. I also know my technology market. I do specialize within the Salesforce world. So like you, Amanda, I have, all sorts of like search strings pulling alerts when it comes to the different industries. And even when like PPP came around last, what was it, April, for all of our financial services clients, like we all knew right away that the technology we work with is going to be processing a lot of these small business loans and helping people sell those. So it's like the industry knowledge for me kind of comes from, these trends, but I think it is so much of the role I play in this. I try to just educate the managers I work with, you know, the business of recruiting, and it really does, it impacts the whole company from day one. A 30-minute phone call can actually tarnish a company's reputation within that industry, or bolster it and say it was amazing. I loved who I spoke with. They spoke to me about their accountability, their inclusion, those sort of things. And one thing that we've kind of been circling around a little bit today, and this is a little unrelated, but I actually kind of want to ask you guys how you do with the ERG side of things. I often find, and I read a letter actually from a woman who had been working internally at Salesforce, talking about the weight placed on the minorities within companies, whatever that might be, women, people of color, you know, different sexual orientations, whatever it might be, the weight of, okay, now educate the rest of us on how we should talk to and treat you and interact with you and provide you opportunities, teach us how to do that. And I often feel like ERGs are such a great space to go, but it's also entirely placed in the hands of, you know, these groups to bring people in, educate in these groups. Like, how do you guys deal with making sure that there's not too much weight being placed on those individuals within the company to create spaces for themselves?
I can probably speak to that. I can probably speak to that. So I think it, first of all, it depends on the culture of your organization, right? I think it's reflective of, I wouldn't say a poor culture, but an organization that's at a point in their journey where they're not entirely mature in their DE&I journey, to create spaces for people that are supposed to be safe spaces for communication and education and camaraderie, and then also put the sole onus on educating the entire company on their shoulders, right? So right there, I think there's inconsistency. That being said, though, one of the most really important things is that simultaneously, while we're creating ERGs, it's important to have charters for ERGs, right? So ERGs are not only, you know, fun spaces in groups, but it's important that they're also organized. So ERGs should have purposes. They should have OKRs. We should know why they exist, what the goals of their existence are. And that should be written down somewhere so that folks don't think that just like a dumpster fire of places where we can go to just dump shit on and ask, you know, random questions of, right? There should also be a more holistic plan where folks can go to ask questions. There should also be a more emphasis on encouraging people to educate themselves, right? Google exists for a reason. And I think we saw a lot of this around George Floyd as well, when folks were going to specifically Black ERGs and Black employees and asking them like way too many questions, or like at a time of traumatic change, you know, and there was so much information that was available, right? And so I also think it's on the onus of the organization to say, hey, look, there's other spaces too, and then to create those spaces, right? So whether it's healing, we did something called healing circles where we brought in therapists, and that's not always going to be necessary, but there's other alternative spaces where organizations can step in to create safe spaces for talking, for education, that don't put the onus on ERGs to do that. And then, that being said, there are safe spaces for ERGs to educate folks on their terms, right? But it shouldn't be an expected thing where, you know, there's just an open door where people can sort of dump their issues and, you know, they're expected to get those things answered. So I think it's really a reflection of the lack of balance that the organization has at this current time, and it's a reflection of where they are in their D&I journey, and there just needs to be a little bit more negotiation around what that means.
Mm-hmm. And I think listening is key, right? At a time that's not a time of crisis, checking in with the ERG populations, diverse populations, about how can we serve as an ally and an advocate, and then creating spaces for employees to share stories about their experience or what they need to thrive, creating, like spaces for employees to connect and, vibe with someone outside their tribe and like make those relationships and, finding ways. Like we have Slack channels for each individual ERG. Most of them are closed to the ERG members. We also have a diversity Slack channel where everyone can participate in the conversation. ERGs can cross post, share information, or, what I've seen that's great is individuals doing their own research and saying, hey, I learned this and I wanted to share, and in adding it to the conversation. And it's really cool when you see a majority group member do that, because then it inspires more to do their own research and share. And I think that's really important. So how do we amplify the voices of our underrepresented groups and give them spaces to educate where they feel comfortable or, or not, and taking time for themselves, and also like creating an environment in which it's encouraged to do your own research and learning and then share that with the broader population.
So we're way above time. Samantha, I actually, in our next conversation, I wanted to talk a little bit more about ERGs and as it pertains to recruiting. So this actually might come up again in the next conversation, Samantha, so stay tuned. But I wanted to sort of do our round robin as we normally do, and everyone come up with one idea that they want to leave everyone with in terms of started from the bottom, now we're here, and leave the audience with one takeaway as to either why it's important to recruit for transferable skills, or one thing that they would say to a hiring manager in order to convince them to recruit for transferable skills, or just one takeaway that they would have outside of the conversation today. So, Melissa?
I'll go first because I have
Samantha, you got to go. Okay, hit it.
Yeah, I have a meeting at 2 and I have some stuff I need to prep, but it's fine. But I think the thing I'll leave with is really just the idea that diversity of thought brings new solutions into the organization. And I think that while we're all working remote, we've all realized like you don't have to live outside New York City or the Bay Area, or you don't have to live in that area to be able to solve the problems that we're dealing with as a business. And like opening up the diversity of opportunity to the entire country and bringing just people who live somewhere else might also just think through things differently than the people who live in the same city and see the same ads for the same companies, all that stuff. Like you actually can bring huge business acumen just by living elsewhere and being exposed to different, kind of environments on that end. So I do have to run, but it was lovely chatting with you all. Thank you so much for your time.
And I guess I can leave, this is something I think you'd kind of started to allude to, Christina, but this is something I had read and I actually, I'm always trying to be helpful and stuff like that too. But one of the things that I learned is beware the committee, right? Because that's, we're all putting in free work for things that are not, our full-time jobs if we're not the diversity and inclusion person. And so it's also, just, I guess, keeping in mind kind of where to draw the line of like, okay, when is this sort of a part of my role and I can, kind of expand upon that, or when is it, just sort of I'm a committee member on all these committees and putting in all this extra time that I'm not getting, credit for because I'm passionate about it and I love it. But it's also one of those situations where we need to kind of, embed it in the DNA of our companies as well.
Cool. Thanks, Melissa. Amanda?
My final thought is thinking about internal promotions or creating opportunity. I think we talk to a lot of people as recruiters. We talk with a lot of hiring managers, and one way that we can influence is try to make sure that our hiring managers are speaking about their employees, especially employees from underrepresented groups. Like, talking about them in the right place and in the right way at the right time. I think often we'll see, individuals who haven't been, like, their skills, their strengths, their opportunities, they haven't been evangelized. As a recruiter, sometimes you can say, well, hey, what about this person? They've done these amazing things. But you can also try to inspire that person's manager to speak up and to share, the great work that someone's doing, because that makes the internal mobility process and the internal promotion process that much easier for that individual. And if we can normalize in our companies to speak about people, all people, not just the people like me or the people who are the squeaky wheels, right? Promote individuals appropriately, be their allies, be their supporters. So do that as a recruiter, inspire your hiring managers to do that. And it will make that internal movement process so much easier for someone if other individuals know what their achievements have been.
Sponsorship, absolutely. Thank you so much. And my really quick final thought is we have to get out of our silos and really mesh with other parts of the business in order to make this super successful, and be not only business partners on a surface level, but really understand that it's going to take all of us in order to have huge impact, even to the point where we're providing our hiring managers tidbits, where we become the SMEs, right? And we're giving them tidbits on how they could become more exposed to, maybe they're experts in the business, but they're only seeing majority voices in their expertise. And so we're exposing them to other voices as well. Super long session today, y'all. So sorry we went a little bit over. Really enjoy you. Second Tuesday of every month at 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. We'll see you next month. Thanks.